What if a queen ruled one of the world's most powerful empires but spent her evenings sketching her dogs? What if a pharaoh's greatest passion wasn't power, but collecting exotic plants? What if the woman who held the fate of nations in her hands was terrified of cats? The great sweep of history often smooths over the people inside the crowns. We see the portraits, the palaces, the politics, but we miss the person, we miss the strange habits, the private fears, the quiet hobbies that made them who they were. These are the details that bring them back to life. Number 23, did a queen run one of the world's biggest corporations? Wilhelmina of the Netherlands was the world's first female billionaire. She was also famously frugal. She rode her bicycle around her palace grounds. She would knit and darn her own stockings even during government meetings. When she lived in exile in England during the Second World War, she insisted on shopping at the local village stores herself, refusing special treatment. Wilhelmina was not just a queen, she was an incredibly sharp businesswoman. Her personal fortune, inherited from her family, was vast. But she didn't just sit on it, she actively managed her investments. She was the largest single shareholder in companies like Royal Dutch Shell and KLM, the Dutch airline. She understood markets. She followed stock reports. Her financial advisors were often astonished by her deep knowledge of her own portfolio. She wasn't just signing papers. She was making decisions, asking tough questions, and directing her own wealth with the skill of a CEO. She came to the throne at the age of 10 in 1890. Her mother, Emma, served as regent until she turned 18. From the very beginning, Wilhelmina had a powerful sense of duty and a will of iron. She was small in stature, but her presence was immense. People who met her said she had an almost intimidating intensity. She did not suffer fools gladly. She could cut down a minister with a few sharp words if she felt he was unprepared or trying to mislead her. Her personal life was simple. She loved to paint. Her works, mostly landscapes, were quite good. She would set up her easel outdoors and spend hours capturing the light. This was her escape from the pressures of the state. She also had a deep love for animals, particularly her dogs. But her pragmatism extended even here. She believed in practical solutions for everything. During her 50-year reign, the Netherlands went through enormous changes. It industrialized, it remained neutral during the First World War, a policy she fiercely defended. But her defining moment came in 1940. When her country was invaded, she was evacuated to London. She refused to see herself as a refugee. She saw herself as the head of a government in exile. From London, she broadcast messages to the Dutch people via Radio Oranje. Her voice became a powerful symbol of resistance. She was firm, unwavering, and full of conviction. Winston Churchill called her the only man in the Dutch government. They had a relationship of deep mutual respect, though they often clashed. She was not one to be patronized, not even by the British Prime Minister. She argued for her country's interests with tenacity. After the war, she returned to a hero's welcome. But the world had changed. The Dutch East Indies, a major source of the nation's wealth, moved towards independence. Wilhelmina struggled with this new reality. She had always seen the empire as an integral part of the Netherlands. In 1948, after 50 years on the throne, she abdicated in favor of her daughter Juliana. In retirement, she wrote her autobiography, Lonely but Not Alone. The title speaks volumes. She had lived a life of immense power and privilege, but also one of profound isolation. She had been a monarch since childhood. She never had a normal life. Her wealth couldn't buy her anonymity or, simple friendship. She spent her final years at Hetlu Palace, painting, writing, and reflecting on a life that was anything but ordinary. She was a queen, a CEO, a radio broadcaster, and a painter who darned her own socks. Number 22. Could a queen be deposed by a postage stamp? Liliuokalani, the last reigning monarch of Hawaii, was a gifted musician and composer. She wrote over 150 songs. Her most famous, Aloha O, is known around the world as a song of farewell, but she wrote it years before she would say her own final farewell to her kingdom. She composed it in 1878 after witnessing a tender parting between two lovers on the windward side of Oahu. She was born Lydia Liliuokalani of Hawaii. She was not born to be the ruling queen. But a series of family tragedies meant the crown passed to her brother, Kalakaua, and she became the heir. She was highly educated. She spoke fluent English and Hawaiian. She toured the world as a representative of the Hawaiian Kingdom. She attended Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee in 1887 and was treated as an equal sovereign. Her passion was music. It was the language of her heart. She played the piano, organ, guitar, and zither. She sang in a beautiful alto voice. For her, music was not just a hobby, it was a way to preserve Hawaiian culture and history. Her songs tell stories of love, of nature, of the beauty of the islands. When her brother died in 1891, she ascended to the throne. She was determined to restore power to the monarchy and to the native Hawaiian people. A new constitution known as the Bayonet Constitution of 1887 had stripped the monarchy of much of its authority and disenfranchised many Hawaiian voters. It had been forced upon her brother by a group of powerful American and European businessmen. Liliuokalani wanted to change that. She began drafting a new constitution that would give power back to her people. This move alarmed the business community. They feared losing their economic and political control over the islands, particularly the lucrative sugar trade. In 1893, with the support of United States Marines, they staged a coup. They surrounded the Iolani Palace. The Liliuokalani, wishing to avoid bloodshed, yielded her authority. She did not abdicate. She yielded to the superior force of the United States, trusting that the U.S. government would investigate and restore her to her rightful place. She was wrong. The provisional government, led by the businessmen, established a republic. In 1895, a cache of weapons was found on the palace grounds. Liliuokalani was arrested. She was charged with treason. She was subjected to a public trial, not in a real court, but in the former throne room of her own palace. She was convicted and sentenced to 5 years of hard labor, which was later commuted to imprisonment in an upstairs bedroom of Iolani Palace. For nearly 8 months, she was a prisoner in her own home. She was denied visitors for much of that time. She had her lady-in-waiting, but little other company. To pass the time, she composed music. She wrote songs of sorrow and protest. She also sewed a magnificent quilt. On it, she stitched scenes from her life and symbols of her kingdom. It was an act of defiance, a way of telling her story when her voice was silenced. After her release, she fought tirelessly for the rest of her life to have her kingdom restored. She traveled to Washington, D.C. to plead her case. She wrote books and gave interviews. But in 1898, the United States annexed Hawaii. The postage stamps of the Republic of Hawaii, and later the United States, became the official stamps. The image of the Queen was gone, replaced. It was a small, final confirmation that her reign was over. She lived out her days as a private citizen in her beloved islands, a queen without a kingdom, but forever the composer of its most famous song. Number 21, could you be a queen and still be afraid of your own children? Her Queen Victoria's first name wasn't Victoria, it was Alexandrina. She was named after her godfather, Tsar Alexander I of Russia. She was called Drina within the family. She only began using the name Victoria when she became queen at 18. She hated the name Alexandrina. She thought it sounded foreign and severe. Victoria had a complicated relationship with motherhood. She had 9 children, but she did not enjoy pregnancy or childbirth. She referred to it as the shadow side of marriage. She also disliked babies. She found them ugly and frog-like. She once wrote that an ugly baby was a very nasty object. This was a private admission, of course. Publicly, she was the mother of the nation. As her children grew, her relationships with them were often strained. She was a demanding and controlling mother. She wanted to know everything they were doing. She wrote them long, critical letters. She particularly clashed with her eldest son and heir, Bertie, the future King Edward VII. She thought he was frivolous and irresponsible. She blamed his behavior for the early death of her beloved husband, Albert. It was a burden Bertie had to carry for decades. She wasn't afraid of them in a physical sense. She was afraid of their independence. She was afraid of them making mistakes that would tarnish the reputation of the monarchy. She was afraid of losing control. Her control was total. She had to approve of their choice of spouse. She dictated where they would live. Even as adults with their own families, they were expected to obey her. Despite this difficult side of her personality, Victoria had many passions. She loved to draw and paint. Her sketchbooks are filled with portraits of her children, her pets, and scenes from her travels. She was quite talented. She also loved music and theater. She had a private theater at Windsor Castle where she would watch performances. She spoke several languages. German was her first language, spoken at home with her mother, and later with Prince Albert. She learned English as a child. She also learned French and Italian. Later in life, in her 60s, she decided to learn Hindustani. Her teacher was Abdul Karim, an Indian clerk who became one of her closest confidants. She would practice with him daily, writing in her journal in Urdu script. This relationship caused a scandal in the royal household, but Victoria was fiercely protective of him. Her appetite was legendary. She ate quickly and with great enjoyment. A typical dinner might consist of soup, fish, a roast, a fowl, and several elaborate desserts. Since court etiquette dictated that no one could continue eating after the queen had finished, many of her guests often went hungry. She would finish a multi-course meal in under 30 minutes. Victoria redefined the monarchy. When she came to the throne, it was unpopular. By the time of her death in 1901, it was a revered institution. She and Albert created the image of the royal family that we still recognize today, a symbol of domestic virtue and public duty. But behind that public image was a complex woman. She was a powerful empress who ruled over a quarter of the world's population. She was also a grieving widow who wore black for 40 years, and she was a mother who loved her children but could never quite let them go. Number 20. Did a ruler's love of photography change the course of a nation? Empress Dowager Cixi of China loved photography. In her later years, she posed for hundreds of portraits. This was highly unusual for a Chinese ruler at the time. The camera was a new foreign technology. Many believed it could capture the soul. Cixi, however, saw its power. She used it to craft her own image. In her portraits, she is not a frail old woman. She is the powerful ruler of the Qing dynasty. She is often dressed in elaborate robes surrounded by symbols of power and longevity. In some, she poses as Guanyin, the Buddhist goddess of mercy. It was a masterful piece of public relations. She was presenting herself to the world not as a conservative despot, but as a divine, benevolent figure. Cixi's journey to power was remarkable. She entered the Forbidden City in 1851 as a low-ranking concubine to the Xianfeng Emperor. She was a teenager, but she was intelligent and ambitious, and she had one major advantage: she gave birth to the emperor's only surviving son. When the emperor died in 1861, her 5-year-old son became the Tangji emperor. Cixi, as his mother, became a regent. She would rule China from behind the scenes for nearly 50 years. She was a complex figure. To many Western historians, she was a symbol of corruption and resistance to progress. To many Chinese nationalists, she was the woman who let the country be carved up by foreign powers. But the reality is more nuanced. She supported certain modernization projects. She oversaw the development of railways and telegraphs. She even sent diplomats abroad. But she was always trying to balance change with the preservation of traditional Manchu power. Her daily life in the Forbidden City was one of incredible routine and ritual. She would wake up before dawn. She would spend hours on her makeup and hair. She had famously long nails on her left hand, protected by decorative gold and jade guards. This was a sign that she did not perform manual labor. She was also a great patron of the arts. She loved Chinese opera. She had a 3-story theater built in the Summer Palace. She would watch performances for hours. She also practiced calligraphy and painting. Her works were often signed and given as gifts to court officials. Food was another of her passions. Her meals were legendary. A single dinner could consist of over 100 different dishes prepared by a team of chefs. She would sit at a long table and eunuchs would present the dishes to her. She would only take a small bite from a few of them. This was a security measure to prevent any single dish from being poisoned. Cixi's relationship with the camera began in earnest in the early 1900s. A man named Yu Sunling, the son of a diplomat, had learned photography in France. Cixi was fascinated. She set up a studio in the summer palace. She experimented with different lighting, backdrops, and costumes. The photographs she created were a deliberate attempt to shape her legacy. They showed her power, her piety, and even a surprising touch of playfulness. In one famous photo, she is standing in a boat in the middle of a lotus pond, holding a flower. It's a serene image, a world away from the political turmoil of her reign. But it's an image she carefully controlled. Number 19 was an empress, the brains behind a great military victory. Empress Taitu Batul of Ethiopia was a brilliant military strategist and diplomat. She was the wife of Emperor Menelik II, who ruled from 1889 to 1913. But she was no mere consort. She was a co-equal ruler, a powerful force in her own right. She was often more suspicious of European intentions than her husband was. And she was instrumental in Ethiopia's stunning victory over Italy at the Battle of Adwa in 1896. Taitu was from a noble family in northern Ethiopia. She was highly intelligent and well-educated. She was married 4 times before she married Menelik. She was a shrewd political operator with her own network of supporters. When she married Menelik in 1883, she brought her own political power and military knowledge to the Union. They were a formidable team. She founded Ethiopia's modern capital city, Addis Ababa. The name means new flower. The story goes that she was drawn to the area because of its beautiful hot springs. She built a house for herself there, and soon the rest of the court followed. Her political influence was immense. She would sit in on council meetings. She would offer her own opinions, which were often sharp and insightful. She was deeply skeptical of the treaties Menelik was signing with European powers. She was particularly wary of the Italians. The Treaty of Wuchel, signed in 1889, was a key point of contention. The Italian version of the treaty stated that Ethiopia was required to conduct all foreign affairs through Italy, effectively making it an Italian protectorate. The Amharic version, which Menelik signed, said that Ethiopia could use Italy's services if it chose to. It was a deliberate mistranslation by the Italians. Taitu was one of the first to recognize the deception. She urged her husband to reject the treaty. She was famously quoted as saying, "I am a woman, I do not like war. But I would rather have war than a peace that would cost us our independence." Her firm stance helped to rally the Ethiopian nobility against the Italians. When war came, Taitu was not left behind at the palace. She marched with the army. She commanded her own force of several thousand soldiers. She was a source of inspiration for the troops. But her most important contribution was strategic. The Ethiopian army at Adwa was huge, perhaps 100,000 strong. But feeding an army that size was a logistical nightmare. The Italian strategy was to wait. They believed the Ethiopians would run out of supplies and be forced to disperse. Taitu understood this. She used her own personal wealth and her extensive network to organize supply lines. She made sure the soldiers were fed. She also played a crucial role in intelligence gathering. She had spies who provided information on the Italian positions and movements. Her understanding of the local terrain was superior to the Italians. She helped Menelik choose the battlefield. On March 1st, 1896, the Italian army attacked. They were confident of victory, but they were outmaneuvered and overwhelmed. The Ethiopian forces, well supplied and fighting on home ground, won a decisive victory. It was a shocking defeat for a European colonial power. It secured Ethiopia's independence for decades to come. After the battle, Taitu's reputation was immense. She was celebrated as a hero. In later years, as Menelik's health failed, her political power grew even more. She effectively ran the country. Some of the nobility grew to resent her influence, but no one could deny her intelligence, her patriotism, or her role in one of the greatest military victories in African history. Number 18, why would a queen spend a fortune on a hut? Caroline of Ansbach, the wife of King George II of Great Britain, was one of the most intellectually curious queens in English history. She was fascinated by science, theology, and philosophy. She corresponded with the great thinkers of her day, like the philosopher Leibniz and the writer Voltaire. And she built a hut. It wasn't just any hut. It was called Merlin's Cave. It was a rustic thatched roof building she had constructed in Richmond Gardens in the 1730s. Inside, it was filled with books and scientific instruments. It also contained wax figures of Merlin, the ancient British prophet, and several other historical figures. It was her personal library and intellectual retreat. This might seem eccentric, but it was a statement. Caroline was a German princess who had come to England. By creating a shrine to a mythical British figure like Merlin, she was connecting herself to her new country's history. And by filling it with books and scientific tools, she was signaling her support for the Enlightenment, the great intellectual movement of her age. It was a very clever piece of political and cultural branding. Caroline's intelligence was her defining feature. She was born in 1683 in the German Principality of Ansbach. She was orphaned at a young age and was raised at the sophisticated court of Berlin. There, she received an excellent education. She was so bright that she was offered a marriage to the future Holy Roman Emperor, but she refused because she would have had to convert to Catholicism. She married George Augustus, the future George II, in 1705. It was a genuine love match. He was devoted to her and relied on her advice throughout his life. When they became King and Queen of Great Britain in 1727, she became his most important advisor. The Prime Minister, Sir Robert Walpole, understood this. He realized that the best way to influence the king was through the Queen. He would meet with Caroline before he met with George. They would discuss policy and strategy. She would then manage her husband. George II had a famously short temper, but Caroline knew how to handle him. She would pretend to be persuaded by his arguments, while subtly guiding him to the conclusions she and Walpole had already reached. It was a political partnership that governed Britain for over a decade. She was also a major patron of the arts and sciences. She supported the composer George Frederick Handel. She helped popularize the practice of smallpox inoculation in England, a controversial new medical procedure at the time. She had her own children inoculated to demonstrate its safety. It was a brave and forward-thinking decision. Her intellectual curiosity was endless. She collected medals, cameos, and drawings. She had a vast library. She loved to engage in theological debates with leading churchmen. She was a woman who was truly interested in the world of ideas. Her death in 1737 was a national tragedy. The king was inconsolable. He ordered that the side of his coffin be made removable so that when he died, their remains could be mingled. Caroline was more than just a queen consort. She was a politician, a thinker, and a power broker. She was the intellectual heart of the Georgian court. And her strange little hut in the garden was a perfect symbol of her unique mind. Number 17, did a queen's hairdresser become a government minister? Marie Antoinette did not actually have a hairdresser who became a government minister. But her favorite stylist, Leonard Otti, became so influential that he was known as the Minister of Fashion. His power over the queen's style, and by extension the style of the entire French court, was absolute. The elaborate hairstyles of the late 18th century are one of the most famous symbols of the excess of the French court. And Marie Antoinette was their greatest champion. Her hair was piled high in towering creations called poufs. These were not just hairstyles, they were works of art, often incorporating models of ships, gardens, or even political events. One famous pouf celebrated the French victory at a naval battle with a miniature ship sailing on a sea of powdered curls. These creations were incredibly complex. They were built over a wire frame or a cushion. The queen's own hair was supplemented with false hair. The whole structure was then pomaded and heavily powdered with white or gray powder, which was usually made of starched flour. They were so tall that women sometimes had to kneel on the floor of their carriages to fit inside. Marie Antoinette's interest in fashion went far beyond her hair. She was a leader of style. She worked closely with her dressmaker, Rose Bertin, another commoner who rose to a position of great influence. Together, they abandoned the stiff, formal dresses of the old court. They introduced a simpler, more natural style with lighter fabrics like muslin and cotton. One of these new styles was the chemise à la reine. It was a simple, loose-fitting white muslin dress. When the queen was painted wearing one in 1783, It caused a public scandal. People thought she looked like she was in her underwear. They were used to seeing their queen in formal silks and brocades. It was seen as undignified and inappropriate. The queen's spending on fashion was enormous. It was a constant source of criticism. She was given a generous clothing allowance, but she almost always overspent it. In a country struggling with debt and poverty, her extravagance was seen as a sign of her frivolity and her disconnect from the common people. She was given the nickname Madame Deficit, but there was another side to Marie Antoinette. She was a devoted mother to her 4 children. She had a private retreat at Versailles called the Petit Trianon. There, she created a small model farm, the Hameau de Lorraine. It was a rustic village with a farmhouse, a mill, and a dairy. She would go there with her children to escape the rigid etiquette of the court. She would dress in simple clothes and pretend to be a milkmaid. This too was criticized. People saw it as a ridiculous fantasy, a queen playing at being a peasant while real peasants were starving. But for her, it was a search for a simpler, more authentic life that she could not have in the main palace. She was also a keen musician. She played the harp and the harpsichord. She had a lovely singing voice. She promoted the works of composers like Christoph Willibald Gluck. Her interest in music was genuine and lifelong. The popular image of Marie Antoinette is of a shallow, out-of-touch queen who famously said, "Let them eat cake." There is no evidence she ever said this. The real person was more complex. She was a young Austrian princess thrown into the most sophisticated and treacherous court in Europe. She used fashion as a way to assert her own identity and power, but in the end, the very style she created became a symbol of the old regime's downfall. Number 16, could a ruler rewrite the law just to keep her dog? Catherine the Great of Russia adored her dogs. She had a special fondness for Italian greyhounds. Her favorite was a dog named Zamira. She wrote letters to her friends in which she described Zamira's antics in great detail. She called the dog the most faithful of all my friends. When Zamira died, Catherine was heartbroken. She had the dog buried in the park of her palace at Tsarskoye Selo. She commissioned a special porcelain statue of Zamira, which is now in the Hermitage Museum. The inscription on Zamira's tomb reads, "Here lies Zamira, and all who knew her grieve for her loss." Her love for animals was a constant throughout her long life. The kennels at her palace were said to house hundreds of dogs. She knew many of them by name. This private passion for her pets offers a softer view of a ruler known for her ambition and political ruthlessness. Catherine was born Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, a minor German princess. She came to Russia at the age of 14 to marry the heir to the throne, the future Peter III. She was a brilliant and determined young woman. She immediately set about learning the Russian language and converting to the Russian Orthodox faith. She was determined to be more Russian than the Russians. Her marriage was a disaster. Her husband was immature and unpopular. In 1762, just 6 months after he became emperor, Catherine led a coup against him. With the help of the military, she overthrew him and declared herself Empress of all Russia. She would rule for the next 34 years. Her reign is considered a golden age of the Russian Empire. She expanded its borders significantly. She was a patron of the arts and sciences. She founded the Hermitage Museum. She corresponded with Voltaire and other Enlightenment thinkers. She saw herself as an enlightened despot, a ruler who used her absolute power for the good of her people. She was also a prodigious worker. She would wake at 5 in the morning, light her own fire, and begin her work. She would read and write for hours before her official day began. She wrote not only letters and state documents, but also plays, memoirs, and children's books. Her personal life was the subject of much gossip. After her disastrous marriage, she never remarried. But she had a series of male favorites, many of whom she elevated to high positions. Her most famous favorite was Grigory Potemkin, a brilliant statesman and military leader. Their relationship was a partnership of deep affection and mutual respect. Even after their romantic relationship ended, they remained close friends and political allies. Catherine's contribution to Russian law was significant. She convened a legislative commission to codify the country's laws, though the project was never fully completed. She also introduced some reforms. But the story that she rewrote a law just for her dog is a bit of a legend. What is true is that her dogs were allowed to go anywhere in the palace. They were not subject to the usual rules. They slept in her bedchamber and ran freely through the magnificent halls of the Winter Palace. For them, at least, the Empress's word was the only law that mattered. In number 15, did a queen's parties bankrupt a kingdom? Anne of Denmark, the wife of King James the First of England and VI of Scotland, loved to party. She was a patron of the arts, particularly of theater and masques. Masques were elaborate court entertainments involving music, dance, and spectacular costumes and scenery. They were incredibly expensive, and Anne's passion for them put a huge strain on the royal finances. She was a Danish princess, the daughter of King Frederick II. She was married to James in 1589. Their early years in Scotland were relatively modest. But when James inherited the English throne in 1603, they moved to London. Anne was suddenly the queen of a much wealthier kingdom. She took full advantage of it. Her masques were legendary. She commissioned the best artists of her day to create them. The poet Ben Jonson wrote the scripts. The architect Inigo Jones designed the stunning sets and costumes. These were not simple plays. They were multimedia spectacles with complex machinery to create special effects like flying gods and disappearing clouds. Anne and her ladies-in-waiting would often perform in the masques themselves. This was sometimes controversial. In one early masque, the Mask of Blackness, the queen and her ladies appeared with their skin painted black to portray daughters of the Niger River. The court was shocked. It was seen as unqueenly, but Anne didn't care. She loved the drama and the spectacle. Her spending was not limited to masques. She loved jewelry. She amassed a huge collection of pearls, diamonds, and other gems. She also undertook massive building projects. She transformed Somerset House in London into a magnificent residence, renaming it Denmark House. She hired Inigo Jones to rebuild the Queen's House at Greenwich, one of the first examples of classical architecture in England. All of this cost a fortune. Anne was constantly in debt. She and the king had a difficult relationship. They were very different people. James was a scholar who preferred hunting and the company of his male favorites. Anne was a sociable lover of the arts. They often lived apart, but there was an underlying affection between them. Anne's influence was not just cultural, she was also a clever political operator. She had her own court and her own network of supporters. She was a patron to many ambitious young men. She played a role in court factions and political appointments. She was not just a frivolous spendthrift. She understood that patronage of the arts and a magnificent court were ways of displaying royal power. She had a genuine interest in architecture. Her work with Inigo Jones was groundbreaking. The Queen's House is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It introduced a new style of architecture to England based on classical principles of symmetry and proportion. It was a move away from the traditional Tudor and Jacobean styles. Anne was also a private Catholic in a staunchly Protestant country. This was a source of political tension throughout her reign. She had to practice her faith in secret. When she died in 1619, she was deeply in debt. Her lavish lifestyle had certainly contributed to the financial problems of the crown. But she had also left a significant legacy. She had transformed the English court into a vibrant center of European culture. She had patronized some of the greatest artists of her age, and her buildings helped to change the face of English architecture. She knew how to throw a great party, but her parties had a purpose. Number 14, could a queen rule for decades from a convent? Inyinga of Ndongo and Matambo was a brilliant diplomat and military leader who fought against the Portuguese in 17th century Angola for 4 decades. She was not a queen who ruled from a convent, but her life was one of constant movement, strategy, and adaptation, a world away from the static life of a European court. She was born in 1583. Her father was the king of the Ndongo kingdom. The story goes that She was born with the umbilical cord wrapped around her neck, which was seen as a sign that she would be a proud and powerful person. Nyinga was intelligent and ambitious from a young age. She learned to read and write in Portuguese from missionaries. She was a skilled warrior. She accompanied her father into battle. When her brother became king, he was not as effective a ruler. He sent Nyinga to negotiate a peace treaty with the Portuguese governor in Luanda. The story of this meeting is famous. The governor, trying to humiliate her, provided only one chair in the room for himself. He expected her to stand. Instead, Nyinga ordered one of her servants to get down on her hands and knees. Nyinga then sat on her servant's back as if it were a throne, meeting the governor at eye level. It was a powerful statement. She was not a subordinate. She was an equal. After her brother's death, Nyinga became queen. The Portuguese refused to recognize her. They supported a rival claimant to the throne. For years, Nyinga led a guerrilla war against them. She was a brilliant military tactician. She formed alliances with other local kingdoms and even with the Dutch, who were rivals of the Portuguese. And she was constantly on the move, leading her army through the Angolan interior. Her camp was her capital. It was a mobile court, a military headquarters, and a symbol of resistance. She was known for her courage and her ability to inspire her soldiers. In the 1640s, she conquered the nearby kingdom of Matamba, which was less exposed to Portuguese attacks. She combined it with Ndongo and ruled as queen of both kingdoms. This gave her a secure base from which to continue her fight. Nyinga was a master of political theater. She adopted many masculine customs to reinforce her authority. She dressed as a man in battle. She maintained a group of male consorts who were required to dress as women. These actions were designed to challenge traditional gender roles and to project an image of absolute power. Late in her life, in her 70s, she made a strategic decision. She converted to Catholicism. This was not necessarily a sign of deep personal faith. It was a diplomatic move. It helped her to secure a peace treaty with the Portuguese. It also helped to legitimize her rule in the eyes of Europeans. She established a Christian court and encouraged missionary activity. She ruled until her death in 1663 at the age of 80. She had spent her entire adult life fighting to preserve the independence of her people. She had used diplomacy when possible and war when necessary. She had adapted her strategies, her alliances, and even her religion to suit her political goals. She was one of the most remarkable leaders in African history, a queen who ruled not from a palace, but from a saddle. Number 13, did a queen design her own coins? And Nur Jahan, the empress of the Mughal Empire in the early 17th century, was one of the most powerful women in Indian history. She was so powerful that coins were issued jointly in her name and the name of her husband, the Emperor Jahangir. The inscription on some of these coins read, "By order of King Jahangir, gold has 100 splendors with the name of Nur Jahan, the Empress." This was unprecedented. No Mughal empress before her had ever had her name on the official currency. It was a clear sign of her immense power and influence. Nur Jahan was not born to be an empress. Her birth name was Mer Nissa. She was born in Kandahar, in modern-day Afghanistan, to a noble Persian family who were migrating to India. She was beautiful, intelligent, and highly educated. She was a talented poet and a sharp businesswoman. She was first married to a Persian adventurer. After his death, she entered the court of the Emperor Jahangir as a lady-in-waiting. Jahangir was captivated by her beauty and intelligence. In 1611, he married her. He gave her the title Nur Jahan, which means light of the world. Jahangir was a capable ruler, but he was also addicted to opium and alcohol. As his health declined, he delegated more and more power to Nur Jahan. She became the de facto ruler of the empire. She would sit behind a screen in the court, listening to petitions and issuing orders. Her name appeared on official documents. She was a brilliant administrator. She took a keen interest in trade and commerce. She owned her own ships that traded with Europe and the Middle East. She accumulated a vast personal fortune. She was also a great patron of architecture. She built magnificent gardens and tombs. Her most famous commission is the tomb of Itimad ud Dawla in Agra, the tomb of her father. It is a beautiful building made of white marble and decorated with intricate inlaid stonework. It is often called the Babi Taj and is considered a forerunner of the Taj Mahal. Nur Jahan was also a fashion trendsetter. She designed new styles of clothing and fabrics. She is credited with inventing the art of chikan embroidery, which is still popular in Lucknow today. She was not just a woman of culture, she was also a woman of action. She was an excellent shot with a rifle. The story goes that she once killed 4 tigers with 6 shots from the top of a hunting elephant. She even led troops into battle on one occasion to rescue her husband who had been captured by a rebellious general. Her power was not without its challenges. She tried to secure the succession for the prince of her choice, which brought her into conflict with other factions at court, including her stepson, the future emperor Shah Jahan. When Jahangir died in 1627, Nur Jahan's power came to an end. Shah Jahan became emperor and placed her under house arrest. She spent the rest of her life in comfortable retirement in Lahore. She dedicated her time to charitable works and to overseeing the construction of her husband's tomb. Nur Jahan's story is remarkable. She rose from a family of immigrants to become the most powerful person in one of the world's richest empires. She was a politician, a businesswoman, an architect, and a warrior. And the coins that bore her name were a testament to the extraordinary power she wielded. Number 12, why did a queen give up her throne to study books? Christina of Sweden was one of the most learned women of the 17th century. She was a scholar, a philosopher, and a patron of the arts. She was also the reigning queen of one of Europe's great military powers, and in 1654, at the age of 27, she gave it all up. She abdicated her throne, converted to Catholicism, and moved to Rome. Why? The simple answer is that she valued her intellectual and personal freedom more than she valued her crown. And Christina became queen when she was just 6 years old, after her father, the great warrior king Gustavus Adolphus, was killed in battle in 1632. She was raised as a prince. She received a rigorous education. She studied classics, philosophy, theology, and languages. She was a brilliant student. By the time she was a teenager, she was fluent in German, French, Italian, and Latin. She was also an unconventional young woman. She disliked traditional feminine pursuits. She dressed in men's clothing. She was an expert horsewoman and hunter. She had a deep voice and a direct, often brusque manner. When she came of age, she took control of the government. She was a dedicated ruler. She would spend 10 hours a day on state business. She worked to end the 30 Years' War, which her father had entered with such success. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 was a major achievement of her early reign, but her real passion was for learning. She wanted to make Stockholm the Athens of the North. She invited scholars and artists from all over Europe to her court. Her most famous guest was the French philosopher René Descartes. She would have him come to her library at 5 o'clock in the morning to discuss philosophy. The cold Swedish mornings were said to have contributed to the pneumonia that led to Descartes' death. Christina spent a fortune on books, manuscripts, and works of art. She built up a magnificent library. But she grew increasingly tired of the business of ruling. She had no desire to marry, which was a major political problem. A queen was expected to marry and produce an heir. Christina refused. She also began to have a secret spiritual crisis. She was the head of the Lutheran Church in Sweden, but she found herself drawn to Catholicism. This was a forbidden faith in her country. So she made her shocking decision. She would abdicate. She named her cousin Charles as her successor. In a formal ceremony, she had the regalia of queenship removed from her one by one. She then left Sweden, traveling across Europe in disguise, dressed as a man. She made her formal conversion to Catholicism in Brussels, and then traveled to Rome. She was welcomed as a great celebrity. She established a new court in Rome, which became a center of art and music. She sponsored composers like Scarlatti and Corelli. She continued to collect books and art. She lived the rest of her life as a free woman, a queen without a kingdom, but a leader in the world of ideas. Her decision was incomprehensible to many of her contemporaries. But for Christina, it was the only logical choice. She had traded a crown for a library, and she never seemed to regret it. Number 11. Could a queen's bad teeth change a country's religion? Elizabeth I of England had a famous sweet tooth. Sugar was a new and expensive luxury in the 16th century. It was a status symbol. Elizabeth consumed it in large quantities. She had sugar in her wine. She ate candied fruits and elaborate marzipan sculptures. And the result was that her teeth were famously black and decayed. A German visitor to her court noted that her teeth were black, a defect the English seemed subject to from their great use of sugar. Her dental problems were so severe that she was often in pain. In 1578, she had a toothache that tormented her for days. Her counselors urged her to have the tooth pulled, but the queen was terrified of the pain of extraction. To encourage her, one of her loyal counselors, the Bishop of London, who was an old man with few teeth left, had one of his own teeth pulled in front of her to show her it was not so bad. His brave act persuaded the queen to undergo the procedure. This small personal detail reveals something about Elizabeth. She was a ruler of immense courage and political skill, but she was also a human being with ordinary fears. Elizabeth's reign is famous for the religious settlement she established. Her father, Henry V, had broken with the Catholic Church. Her half-brother, Edward VI, had pushed the country towards a radical Protestantism. Her half-sister, Mary I, had brutally tried to restore Catholicism. When Elizabeth came to the throne in 1558, the country was deeply divided. Elizabeth's solution was a compromise. She established the Church of England as a Protestant church, but she kept many of the traditional ceremonies and structures of the old church, such as bishops and cathedrals. It was a middle way designed to appeal to the majority of her subjects who were tired of religious conflict. She was famously pragmatic about religion. She is said to have declared that she did not want to make windows into men's souls. She was more concerned with outward loyalty to her church and state than with private beliefs, but she could be ruthless when she felt her security was threatened. She faced numerous plots against her life, many of them centered on her Catholic cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. For years, Elizabeth kept Mary imprisoned in England. Finally, after Mary was implicated in a plot to assassinate Elizabeth, the Queen reluctantly signed her cousin's death warrant. Elizabeth's personal life was a matter of constant political speculation. She never married. She used her single status as a diplomatic tool, playing one foreign suitor against another. She famously declared that she was married to England. She cultivated a powerful public image as the Virgin Queen, a ruler who had sacrificed her personal happiness for the good of her people. She was also a master of language. Her speeches are some of the most famous in English history. When England faced the threat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, she went to Tilbury to address her troops. She told them, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." It was a masterful performance that inspired a nation. She was a frugal ruler, a stark contrast to her father. She hated to spend money, but she understood the importance of display. Her court was magnificent, and her own wardrobe was legendary. She had over 2,000 dresses, but many of them were gifts or old dresses that had been remade. She would wear a single gown for years. Her black teeth, a result of her love for sugar, were a small, visible flaw in the carefully constructed image of Gloriana, the ageless queen. Number 10 was a queen's hobby, the key to her political power. Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII, is often remembered for her dramatic downfall. But before she was queen, she was a highly sophisticated and educated woman. And her real passion was for the new religious ideas of the Reformation. Her personal collection of books and her habit of marking them up with her own notes reveals a sharp and engaged mind. Anne spent her formative years at the courts of the Netherlands and France. These were centers of Renaissance learning and culture. She learned to speak fluent French. She developed a taste for French fashion and art. But more importantly, she was exposed to the new religious thinking that was sweeping across Europe. When she returned to England in the early 1520s, She brought these ideas with her. She was a supporter of what was called the New Learning. She read the works of reformist thinkers. She owned a copy of William Tyndale's English translation of the New Testament, a book that was banned in England at the time. To own it was dangerous. To read it was an act of defiance. Anne didn't just own these books, she studied them. Several of her books survive today. They are filled with her annotations in the margins. She underlined passages. She wrote her own comments. This shows that she was not just a passive reader, she was actively engaging with the text, forming her own opinions. Her religious beliefs were a key part of her appeal to Henry V. Henry wanted to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. The Pope refused. Anne and her circle of reformist friends provided the king with a radical solution he could break with the authority of the Pope altogether. He could declare himself the supreme head of the church in England. Anne gave Henry books that supported this idea. She showed him passages in the Bible that suggested that kings had authority over the church in their own lands. Her intellectual and religious convictions provided the theological justification for the English Reformation. It was not just about the king's desire for a new wife and a male heir. It was also about a fundamental shift in religious and political power. As queen, Anne continued to promote the reformist cause. She appointed reformist bishops and chaplains. She supported the printing of the Bible in English so that ordinary people could read it for themselves. She was a patron of scholars and universities. Her personal emblem was a white falcon. It was a symbol of her ambition and her purity. She was a woman who was determined to make her mark on the world. Of course, her reign was short, and her end was tragic. When she failed to provide Henry with a son, he turned against her. She was accused of treason and executed in 1536. But her legacy was profound. She was not just a pawn in a king's game. She was an active player, a woman whose intellectual passions helped to change the course of English history. Her collection of books was not just a hobby, it was her arsenal. Number 9, did a queen walk for 200 miles in the middle of winter for love. Juana of Castile, known as Juana la Loca or Joanna the Mad, is one of history's most tragic figures. The story that she walked for 200 miles with her husband's coffin is part of the legend that has grown up around her. The reality is even stranger. For months, she traveled with his body across the Spanish countryside, refusing to let him be buried. Juana was the daughter of the famous Catholic monarchs Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon. She was a highly intelligent and passionate young woman. She was well educated, a skilled musician, and fluent in several languages. In 1496, she was sent to Flanders to marry Philip the Handsome, the Duke of Burgundy. By all accounts, she fell deeply in love with him. But their marriage was volatile. Philip was ambitious and unfaithful. Juana was intensely jealous. Their public quarrels were the scandal of the European courts. Through a series of deaths in her family, Juana became the heir to the vast kingdom of Castile. When her mother Isabella died in 1504, Juana became Queen of Castile. Her father Ferdinand and her husband Philip immediately began to jockey for power. They both claimed that Juana was mentally unstable and unfit to rule. It's difficult to know the true state of Juana's mental health. She was certainly prone to fits of depression and rage. But her political rivals had a vested interest in exaggerating her instability. It was a convenient excuse to sideline her and take power for themselves. In 1506, Philip died suddenly of a fever. Juana was devastated. Her grief was profound and all-consuming. This is where her strange journey began. She had his body embalmed and placed in a magnificent coffin. But she refused to have him buried. Instead, she set out from the city of Burgos with a large procession accompanying the coffin. She traveled only at night because, she said, a widow who has lost the son of her own soul should not be seen in the light of day. They would stop at a monastery or a convent during the day. Juana would have the coffin open so she could see her husband's face. This macabre procession lasted for 8 months. They traveled through the harsh Castilian winter. It was a spectacle of grief that both horrified and fascinated her subjects. Finally, her father, Ferdinand, intervened. He convinced Juana to allow the coffin to be interred at a convent in the town of Tordesillas. And then he had Juana confined to the palace convent there. She would spend the next 46 years of her life as a prisoner in Tordesillas. She was the rightful queen of Castile, but she never ruled. First her father, and then her son, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, ruled in her name. They kept her isolated from the world. She was neglected. She lived in squalor for long periods. Her mental and physical health deteriorated. She died in 1555 in her 70s. She had been a queen in name for over 50 years, but a prisoner for almost all of that time. Her long, dark journey with her husband's body was just the beginning of a lifetime of sorrow and confinement. Number 8. Why did a queen get married at age 12 to a man, 3 times her age? Jadwiga of Poland was crowned king in 1384. Not queen, but king. The Polish nobility wanted to make it clear that she was the ruler in her own right, not just a consort to a future husband. She was only 10 years old at the time. Her story is one of personal sacrifice for the good of her country. Jadwiga was the daughter of Louis the Great, King of Hungary and Poland. She was a beautiful and intelligent child raised at the sophisticated court of Buda. From a young age, she was betrothed to William of Habsburg, a young Austrian prince. She had grown up with the expectation that she would marry him. But when her father died, the Polish nobles had other plans. They wanted to end the union with Hungary, and they saw an opportunity. They invited the young Jadwiga to come to Poland and be their monarch, but they had one condition. She had to break her engagement to William. Instead, they wanted her to marry Jogaila, the Grand Duke of Lithuania. Jogaila was a pagan, a man in his late 30s, and considered a barbarian by many in Christian Europe. But a marriage between Jadwiga and Jogaila would create a powerful Polish-Lithuanian union. It would be a strategic alliance that could counter the growing threat of the Teutonic Knights, a powerful military order on their border. And it would bring the vast territory of Lithuania into the Christian fold. Jadwiga was devastated. She was a devout Christian, and she considered her betrothal to William to be a binding promise. She was only a child, and she was being asked to give up the man she expected to marry for a stranger from a foreign land. The story goes that she tried to run away and had to be physically stopped by the nobles at the gates of the castle. But Jadwiga was also deeply pious and had a strong sense of duty. She prayed for guidance. In the end, she agreed. She put the needs of her kingdom and her faith above her own personal happiness. In 1386, at the age of 12, she married the 36-year-old Jogaila. He was baptized, taking the Christian name Ladislaw, and was crowned King of Poland alongside her. The Polish-Lithuanian Union was formed. It would become one of the most powerful states in Eastern Europe for centuries. Jadwiga did not fade into the background. She remained an active ruler. She was a skilled diplomat. She led peace negotiations. She was known for her charity and her piety. She founded hospitals and churches. She was a patron of the arts and learning. She donated all of her personal jewelry to restore the University of Krakow, which is now known as the Jagiellonian University, in honor of her dynasty. She died in 1399 at the age of 25, shortly after giving birth to her first child, who also died. Her death was a cause of national mourning. She had ruled for only 15 years, but her impact was immense. She had secured the future of her kingdom through her personal sacrifice. She was later canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church, not just for her piety, but for the profound political legacy she left behind. She was the young queen who became a king and a saint. Number 7. Could a queen run a country while her husband was away on crusade? Eleanor of Aquitaine was not just a queen. She was a force of nature. She was Queen of France, then Queen of England, and the Duchess of her own vast territory of Aquitaine in southwestern France. And yes, she absolutely ran countries while her husbands were away. She became Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right at the age of 15 in 1137. This made her the most eligible heiress in Europe. Her lands were larger and richer than those of the King of France. She was married off almost immediately to Louis II of France. A few years later, in 1147, she insisted on accompanying her husband on the Second Crusade. This was highly unusual for a queen. She brought her own contingent of vassals and ladies in waiting. Her presence on the crusade caused a scandal. There were rumors of her inappropriate behavior, particularly with her own uncle, Raymond of Antioch. The crusade was a military disaster, and so was her marriage to Louis. They were incompatible. He was pious and monkish. She was worldly and high-spirited. They eventually had their marriage annulled in 1152 on the grounds that they were too closely related. Just 8 weeks later, Eleanor made a stunning move. She married the young Henry of Anjou, who was 11 years her junior. 2 years after that, he became King Henry II of England. Eleanor was now Queen of England. Her vast French territories were now tied to the English crown, creating a massive Angevin empire that stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees. She gave Henry 8 children, including 2 future kings of England, Richard the Lionheart and John. But her relationship with Henry was just as stormy as her marriage to Louis. Henry was a powerful and brilliant ruler, but he was also unfaithful. In the 1160s, Eleanor moved back to Aquitaine and set up her own court in Poitiers. This court became a famous center of art, music, and poetry. It was the age of courtly love, and Eleanor was its greatest patron, but she was also a political player. She encouraged her sons to rebel against their father in 1173. The rebellion failed. Henry was furious. He had Eleanor captured and imprisoned. She would spend the next 16 years as a prisoner, moved from castle to castle in England. Her chance for freedom came in 1189 when Henry II died. Her favorite son, Richard the Lionheart, became king. His first act was to free his mother. Richard was a great warrior, but he had little interest in the day-to-day business of governing England. He spent most of his reign on crusade or fighting in France. During his long absences, it was Eleanor, now in her late 60s, who ruled England. She was the regent in all but name. She managed the finances, raised the ransom when Richard was captured on his way back from the crusade, and put down a rebellion by her youngest son, John. She was a shrewd and effective administrator. When Richard died, she supported John's claim to the throne. She continued to be a political force well into her old age. In her late 70s, she traveled across the Pyrenees to choose a bride for the heir to the French throne. She died in 1204. In her early 80s, she had outlived most of her children. She had been a duchess, a queen of 2 countries, a crusader, a prisoner, and a ruler. Her life spanned the 12th century. She was one of the most remarkable women of the Middle Ages. Number 6. Why did a queen personally interrogate heretics? Isabella I of Castile was a woman of intense, unwavering faith. This faith was the driving force behind many of her most famous and controversial policies. She saw herself as a defender of Catholicism, and she was willing to go to great lengths to ensure the religious unity of her kingdom. She and her husband Ferdinand of Aragon are known as the Catholic monarchs. They unified Spain and sponsored the voyage of Christopher Columbus. But they also established the Spanish Inquisition in 1478. The Inquisition was a church court designed to root out heresy. Its main targets were conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity but were suspected of secretly practicing their old faith. Isabella took a personal interest in the work of the Inquisition. It was not something she simply delegated. There are records of her attending the auto da fe, the public ceremonies where the condemned were punished. And there are accounts that suggest she was sometimes present during the interrogations. This seems shocking to modern sensibilities. But for Isabella, it was a matter of spiritual duty. She believed that heresy was a disease that threatened the soul of her kingdom. She believed she had a divine mission to purify her lands. Her faith was forged in a difficult childhood. She grew up in a court filled with political intrigue. Her claim to the throne of Castile was not secure. She had to fight a civil war to win her crown. These early struggles made her tough, determined, and deeply reliant on her faith. Her marriage to Ferdinand in 1469 was a political masterstroke. It united the 2 largest kingdoms in Spain, Castile, and Aragon. They ruled jointly a partnership of 2 shrewd and effective monarchs. The motto they adopted was Tanto monta, monta tanto, Isabel como Fernando, meaning they amount to the same, Isabella and Ferdinand. Their most famous achievement was the completion of the Reconquista, the centuries-long Christian effort to retake the Iberian Peninsula from the Muslim Moors. In 1492, their armies captured the last Muslim stronghold, the city of Granada. It was a moment of triumph for Isabella. She had achieved a goal her ancestors had pursued for generations. It was in that same year, 1492, that she made two other fateful decisions. She authorized Columbus's voyage, a gamble that would change the world, and she issued the Alhambra Decree, which ordered all Jews in Spain to either convert to Christianity or leave the country. It was a brutal act of religious intolerance, but for Isabella, it was the logical conclusion of her quest for a unified Catholic Spain. And Isabella was also a devoted mother. She had 5 children. She took a keen interest in their education, ensuring that her daughters were as well educated as her son. Her daughter, Catherine of Aragon, would later become the first wife of Henry V of England. She was a woman of simple personal tastes. She dressed modestly. She was frugal. But she understood the importance of royal splendor. Her court was magnificent. She was a small woman with fair hair and blue eyes, but she had an aura of immense authority. When she spoke, people listened. She was a ruler who shaped her world according to her own iron will and her absolute faith. Number 5. Could a sovereign ruler also be a saint? Irene of Athens was a Byzantine empress who ruled in the late 8th century. She was beautiful, ambitious, and ruthless. She was also a champion of religious icons, a stance that eventually led to her being recognized as a saint by the Eastern Orthodox Church. It's a strange combination, a ruler known for her political scheming, who is also venerated for her piety. Irene came to Constantinople from Athens in 768 to marry the heir to the throne, Leo IV. She was an orphan from a noble family. When her husband became emperor, she became empress. And when he died in 780, she became the regent for their 9-year-old son, Constantine VI. This was her moment. Irene was determined to rule. For the next decade, she governed the vast Byzantine Empire. She was a capable administrator. She cut taxes. She repaired aqueducts. But her main project was religious. For decades, the Byzantine Empire had been torn apart by a controversy known as iconoclasm. The iconoclasts, including Irene's late husband and father-in-law, believed that the veneration of religious images or icons was a form of idolatry. They had ordered the destruction of icons throughout the empire. Irene was an iconodule, someone who believed in the veneration of icons. She had secretly held this belief even during her husband's reign. Now that she was in power, she set about to reverse the policy. In 787, she convened the Second Council of Nicaea. This church council officially restored the veneration of icons. It was a major victory for Irene and a defining moment for the Orthodox faith. But as her son Constantine grew older, he wanted to rule in his own right. A power struggle developed between mother and son. At first, Constantine managed to push his mother aside. But Irene was a master of conspiracy. In 797, she staged a coup against her own son. She had him captured, brought to the palace where he was born, and blinded. He died from his injuries shortly after. Irene now ruled alone. She was the first woman to rule the Byzantine Empire, not as a regent, but as a sole ruler. She styled herself not as empress, but as emperor, or Basilius. It was a bold claim to absolute authority. Her reign as sole ruler was short-lived. She was a skilled politician, but she was not a military leader. The empire faced threats on its borders. At court, her finance ministers plotted against her. In 802, she was overthrown in a palace coup. She was exiled to the island of Lesbos. The new emperor gave her no pension. The former ruler of one of the world's great empires was forced to support herself by spinning wool. She died a year later. Her legacy is complex. She was a ruthless politician who committed a terrible act against her own son. But for the Orthodox Church, her defense of icons was a heroic act. It preserved a central part of their religious practice. And so, despite her personal sins, she is remembered as Saint Irene. She is a reminder that in history and in faith, things are rarely simple. Number 4, how did a commoner become the most powerful woman in the world? Theodora was an actress. In the 6th century Byzantine Empire, this was not a respected profession. Actresses were considered to be on the lowest rung of society, along with prostitutes and criminals. But Theodora was not just an actress. She was intelligent, witty, and beautiful, and she caught the eye of the heir to the throne, Justinian. Justinian fell deeply in love with her. He wanted to marry her. But the law forbade a man of senatorial rank from marrying an actress. So Justinian had his uncle, the Emperor Justin, change the law. In 525, they were married. 2 years later, they were crowned Emperor and Empress of the Byzantine Empire. The commoner from the circus was now the co-ruler of the Roman world. Theodora was not a passive consort. She was a true partner to her husband. She was his most trusted advisor. Her name appears alongside his in the laws they passed. She had her own court, her own staff, and her own political agenda. Her most famous moment came in 532 during the Nika riots. A massive uprising broke out in Constantinople. The city was in flames. The emperor's palace was under siege. Justinian and his advisors were ready to flee. It was Theodora who saved the throne. She stood up in the council and gave a powerful speech. She said she would not run away. She said royal purple is a noble shroud. She argued that it was better to die an emperor than to live as an exile. Her courage shamed the men into action. Justinian ordered his generals to attack the rioters in the Hippodrome. The rebellion was crushed. Theodora had saved her husband's crown. She never forgot her humble origins. She was a champion of the poor and the downtrodden. She was particularly concerned with the rights of women. She passed laws that gave women more rights in divorce. She established a convent for former prostitutes, a safe haven where they could rebuild their lives. She was also deeply involved in the religious controversies of the day. She was a supporter of the Monophysite Christians, a group that was considered heretical by the mainstream Orthodox Church. She used her influence to protect Monophysite bishops and monks from persecution. Theodora was a woman of great luxury and style. She loved jewels and fine clothes. The famous mosaics in the church of San Vitale in Ravenna, Italy, show her and Justinian in all their imperial splendor. She is depicted with a halo, a sign of her sacred status as empress. She died in 548, likely from cancer. Justinian was heartbroken. He never remarried. He outlived her by almost 20 years, but his reign was never the same without her. The historian Procopius, who disliked Theodora and wrote a scandalous secret history about her, still had to admit that she was a woman of incredible intelligence and will. She had journeyed from the gutter to the throne and had proven herself to be one of the most remarkable empresses in history. Number 3, did a Chinese empress create her own words? Wu Zetian, the only woman to ever rule China as emperor in her own right, was a master of language and symbols. She was so intent on marking her reign as unique that she actually invented a dozen new Chinese characters. These characters were designed to replace common words like nation, sun, and moon. One of the most famous was the character for her own name, Zhao. It was a complex character designed to look like the sun and moon in the sky. This was a radical act. The Chinese writing system was ancient and revered. To change, it was to change the very fabric of culture. But that was exactly Wu Zetian's point. She was not just another ruler in a long line of men. She was something new. She was founding her own dynasty, the Zhou, and her new characters were a way of stamping her authority on the world. Wu Zetian's rise to power was extraordinary. She entered the court of Emperor Taizong in the 7th century as a young teenage concubine. After his death, she was sent to a Buddhist convent, as was the custom for childless concubines, but she had caught the eye of the new emperor, Gaozong, who was Taizong's son. He brought her back to the palace. From there, her rise was swift and ruthless. She outmaneuvered her rivals, including the empress and other high-ranking concubines. She became the new empress. As Emperor Gaozong's health failed, she took on more and more of the duties of government. She was the real power behind the throne for decades. When Gaozong died, she ruled through her sons, deposing one and then keeping the other as a puppet. Finally, in 690, she cast aside all pretense. She declared herself emperor, or Huangdi. She was the first and only woman in Chinese history to hold that title. She was a brilliant and effective ruler. She reformed the civil service system, opening it up to talented men from lower-ranking families. This broke the power of the old aristocratic clans. She was a patron of Buddhism. She was a skilled diplomat. She expanded the empire's borders. She was also known for her cruelty. She established a secret police force to eliminate her political enemies. No one who stood in her way was safe, but her interest in language and scholarship was genuine. She was a talented poet and calligrapher. She sponsored a massive project to compile an encyclopedia of famous women. She understood that power was not just about armies and secret police. It was also about controlling the narrative, shaping the culture. Her new characters were part of this project. They were put into official use, they were printed in books and carved on monuments, but they never really caught on with the general public. They were too complicated, too artificial. After her death, they were abandoned, and the old characters were restored. Wu Zetian was forced to abdicate in 705 when she was in her 80s. The Tang dynasty was restored. For centuries, Confucian historians who believed that a woman should never rule condemned her as a wicked usurper. But in the 20th century, her reputation began to be reevaluated. Historians now recognize her as one of China's most capable and fascinating rulers. Her invented characters may have been forgotten, but her extraordinary reign was not. Number 2 was a pharaoh's greatest expedition for plants, not plunder. Hatshepsut was one of the most successful pharaohs of ancient Egypt. She ruled for over 20 years in the 15th century BC. She oversaw a period of peace and prosperity. She was a prolific builder, responsible for some of the most magnificent temples in Egypt, including her stunning mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri. But one of her most famous achievements was not a military campaign or a building project. It was a trading expedition, and its primary goal was to bring back live incense trees. Hatshepsut organized a massive expedition to a mysterious and distant land called Punt. The exact location of Punt is still debated by historians, but it was likely somewhere on the coast of East Africa, perhaps in modern-day Eritrea or Somalia. Punt was famous for its luxury goods, gold, ivory, exotic animals, and, most importantly, frankincense and myrrh. These aromatic resins were crucial to Egyptian religious rituals. They were burned as incense in the temples to honor the gods. Egypt had been trading for them for centuries, but they were usually imported as dried resin. Hatshepsut wanted more. She wanted the trees themselves. The expedition she sent was a major undertaking. A fleet of 5 large ships sailed down the Red Sea. The journey was long and dangerous, but it was a stunning success. The reliefs on the walls of Hatshepsut's temple tell the story of the expedition in vivid detail. They show the Egyptians arriving in Punt, being greeted by the local chief and his wife. They show the ships being loaded with the treasures of Punt. And they show the Egyptians carefully digging up the incense trees, their root balls wrapped in baskets, and carrying them aboard the ships. The reliefs depict 31 live trees being brought back to Egypt. When the expedition returned, it was a moment of national triumph. The treasures were dedicated to the god Amun, and the trees were planted in the gardens of Hatshepsut's temple at Deir el-Bahri. It was the first known successful attempt to transplant foreign trees. This focus on trade and botany rather than on war tells us something important about Hatshepsut's reign. She was a woman who had to legitimize her rule in a male-dominated world. She came to power as a regent for her young stepson, Thutmose III. But within a few years, she had declared herself pharaoh. To bolster her claim, she used propaganda. She claimed that she was the divine daughter of the god Amun. She had herself depicted in the traditional regalia of a male pharaoh, including a false beard. But she also legitimized her rule through her accomplishments: a peaceful and prosperous reign, magnificent building projects, and a successful trading expedition were powerful arguments for her fitness to rule. The expedition to Punt was not just about getting nice-smelling trees. It was a demonstration of her power, her wealth, and the favor of the gods. It was a botanical triumph that was also a political masterstroke. Number one, did the most famous queen of the ancient world write a book on cosmetics? Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, is famous for her political alliances and her dramatic life. But behind the legend was a formidable intellect. Cleopatra was a scholar. She was fluent in at least 9 languages, including Egyptian, Greek, and Latin. She was the first ruler of her dynasty, the Ptolemies, to bother to learn the Egyptian language, and according to later sources, she wrote books. One of the works attributed to her was a text on cosmetics and hairstyling. The Roman medical writer Galen, writing a couple of centuries after her death, quotes several recipes for hair treatments from a book by Cleopatra. It's impossible to know for sure if she wrote it herself or if a work was simply attributed to her because of her fame. But it is entirely plausible. The Ptolemaic court at Alexandria was the intellectual center of the ancient world. It was home to the Great Library of Alexandria and the museum, which was a kind of research institute. Cleopatra was raised in this environment. She was not just a political figure, she was a product of a deep intellectual tradition. She was well versed in mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. She was a skilled administrator. She managed the Egyptian economy with great skill. During a time of famine in the Mediterranean, Egypt was a source of stability, able to feed its own people and export grain. This was due in large part to her effective management. Her reputation as a seductress often overshadows her intelligence. The Roman propaganda, particularly after her defeat, painted her as a decadent, immoral foreign temptress who corrupted noble Roman men. The reality is that her relationships were political alliances. They were calculated moves to preserve the independence of her kingdom in a world increasingly dominated by Rome. Her famous meeting with Julius Caesar, where she was supposedly smuggled into the palace wrapped in a carpet, was a bold political gamble. She needed his support to win a civil war against her own brother. She got it. Her later alliance with Mark Antony was an attempt to create a new power center in the Eastern Mediterranean that could rival the power of Octavian in Rome. Her interest in cosmetics was likely both personal and political. In ancient Egypt, makeup was not just about beauty. It had religious and magical significance. The famous kohl eyeliner worn by both men and women was believed to ward off eye infections and the evil eye. For a queen, appearance was a crucial part of projecting power. Cleopatra's carefully crafted image was a tool of statecraft. When she first met Mark Antony, she sailed up the Cydnus River in a magnificent barge, dressed as the goddess Isis. It was a piece of political theater designed to awe the Roman general and the people of the East. So, a book on cosmetics would not have been a frivolous pursuit for a queen like Cleopatra. It would have been part of a broader interest in science, medicine, and the art of power. We remember her for her death. But it is how she lived as a brilliant multilingual scholar and a shrewd ruler. That is her true legacy. She was not just the subject of history. She was a woman who tried to write her own.